Think about the last time you were in a heated disagreement with someone about politics, religion, or something you cared deeply about. At some point during that conversation, you probably had a thought that felt completely reasonable. If this person just had access to the same information I have, they would see that I'm right. That thought is one of the most consequential cognitive errors a human being can make. And almost everyone makes it about almost everything without noticing. In 1996, psychologists Lee Ross and Andrew Ward at Stanford University published a paper identifying a set of beliefs that they argued nearly every person holds, quietly and without examination, as a background assumption about how their own mind works. They called this cluster of beliefs naive realism, and the name captures something important. The naive part isn't an insult. It describes the unreflective, automatic quality of the assumption. We don't decide to be naive realists. We arrive this way. The core of naive realism consists of three beliefs that build on each other. The first is that I see the world as it actually is, not as it appears to me from my particular position, with my particular history and particular emotional investments, but as it objectively is. My perception feels transparent, like a window, not like a filter. The second belief follows from the first. Rational, well-informed people who encounter the same facts I've encountered will reach the same conclusions I've reached. This feels obvious, because if the world is as I see it, then seeing it accurately just requires access to the same view. The third belief completes the structure. When someone who has encountered the same facts as I have still reaches different conclusions, there must be something wrong with their reasoning. They are biased, or they have a vested interest in a particular conclusion, or they haven't thought carefully enough. Their failure to see what I see requires an explanation. Mine doesn't. This isn't just a philosophical claim. Ross and Ward documented specific behavioral and perceptual consequences of naive realism in experimental settings. People consistently perceive their own judgments as more objective than the judgments of others, rated others' views as more ideologically driven than their own, and expected that neutral observers, people without any stake in a question, would agree with their own position at dramatically higher rates than the neutral observers actually did. The neutral observer was imagined, by both sides, as someone who would look at the facts and arrive at the same conclusion they had, because arriving at that conclusion was simply what looking at the facts would produce. The consequences extend well beyond political debates. Inside personal relationships, the same structure operates with particular intensity, because relationships involve exactly the conditions that make naive realism most damaging. High emotional investment, shared history that both people interpret differently, and a felt sense that one's own experience of events is the accurate account. When two people in a close relationship have a recurring conflict, each person typically experiences their own response as a reaction to what happened, and the other person's response as a character trait or a choice. Neither person usually experiences their position as a position. They experience it as a description of reality. One of the most striking empirical demonstrations of naive realism came from a study conducted in 1985 by Robert Vallone, Ross, and Mark Lepper at Stanford. They recruited two groups, students who were strongly pro-Israeli and students who were strongly pro-Palestinian. Both groups watched the same television news coverage of the 1982 massacre at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Lebanon. Both groups then rated the news coverage for fairness and bias. Both groups concluded that the coverage was biased against their own side. Pro-Israeli students felt the coverage treated Israel unfairly. Pro-Palestinian students felt the same coverage treated Palestinians unfairly. The content they watched was identical. The conclusion they drew, that the media was working against them specifically, was mirror opposite. Vallone, Ross, and Lepper called this the hostile media effect. Its existence only makes sense if you understand naive realism. Each group began with the assumption that their view of the events was the accurate one. From that starting point, balanced coverage looks biased, because it doesn't reflect the objective truth as the viewer understands it. The coverage was giving equal weight to a wrong view. How could that be anything other than unfair? The hostile media effect has since been replicated with sports fans, political partisans across multiple countries, and even groups of scientists reviewing the same data on contested empirical questions. In each case, both sides perceive the same neutral coverage as biased against their position. The pattern is consistent. When people feel strongly that they know what is true, they perceive neutral sources as biased against them. Because neutral, from the perspective of naive realism, isn't possible. Everyone either sees the truth or they're slanting away from it. The reason naive realism is so difficult to correct isn't that people lack the intelligence to question their own perception. It's that we have no direct access to the world outside our perception. Everything you know through your senses, your memory, your interpretation of language, your emotional state when you encountered the information, and the framework of prior beliefs you were already carrying. None of that feels like a framework. It feels like the world. The experience of seeing is transparent in a way that makes it extremely hard to remember that it's an experience and not direct access to external reality. This is why presenting someone with evidence that contradicts their beliefs so rarely produces a meaningful change. The evidence does not arrive alone in a neutral environment where it can be evaluated fairly on its own merits. It arrives inside the recipient's existing understanding of how the world works, where it gets filtered through the same framework that generated the original belief. If the evidence conflicts with what they already believe to be true, the most natural explanation isn't, "I was wrong about the world." It's, "This evidence is flawed," or "the source is biased," or "the question has been framed unfairly." These explanations are entirely consistent with naive realism and require no update to the underlying view. Understanding naive realism changes something practical about how you communicate and how you interpret disagreement. The person arguing with you is not experiencing a different opinion. They're experiencing what they take to be reality, just as you are. From inside their view, they're not biased. They're simply describing what is there. Treating disagreement as willful distortion, rather than as two people who each believe they are accurately reporting what they see, tends to intensify conflict without resolving anything, because neither person's naive realism is visible to themselves. What actually moves people, documented across research on perspective taking and attitude change, is not a better argument. It is an experience that makes the inside of another person's view temporarily accessible. Not being told what someone thinks, but being made to feel, briefly, what it is like to occupy their position, which is an exercise in temporarily suspending the assumption that your own is simply the one that's accurate. Subscribe, because every single week we bring you one more force shaping how you see the world while convincing you that you're not being shaped at all.